The military built this support by directing media attention towards images of success and away from the grim realities of war. Military planners learned their lesson from Vietnam, that modern wars are not won and lost on battlefields, but in front of television screens, where attitudes and perceptions are bought and sold.
Did it work?
Agent Orange was composed of an inevitable byproduct known as dioxin, the most toxic small molecule made by man. We were very shocked when in 1972 our youngest son, Michael, was born with even worse defects, more missing fingers, the same missing wrist bones, and also missing the long bone in his left forearm. And the wrists were turned under in this case too.
It is astonishing just the large proportion of citizens of this country who are content with what I regard as a very kind of thin gruel of information and understanding about the rest of the world, who are content simply to kind of sit there. Now, I think the fault is not only theirs. I think the fault is also in the media and educational system, which tends not to prompt people to see the United States as what it is, part of the rest of the world.
A potpourri of news and special reports, highlighted by two video works, one on the Gulf War and the other one focusing on Vietnam veterans. So we invite you to join us for an informative hour on Alternative Views. Welcome to Alternative Views. This is our 23rd potpourri of a variety of reports and special features. Of particular significance is the video essay on the Gulf War, Lines in the Sand, by Ed Griffin-Nolan. But before we see that and other special features, here are some news stories which we've gleaned from the alternative press.
The journal Cross Currents had an interesting article that indicated that over 1/3 of World Bank projects completed last year were judged failures by the bank's own staff, which is a dramatic 150% rise in failures over the past 10 years. Entitled Effective Implementation, Key to Development Impact, and marked confidential, the report reviewed about 1,800 current bank projects in 113 countries for which the bank has lent $138 billion. The report documents a tremendous amount of failures in recent years in World Bank projects, and most interestingly indicates why these projects have failed. Some of the testimony indicates that the bank has ignored local input in favor of policy mandated from the bank headquarters. One of the critics indicated the bank staff takes a negotiating position, not the consulting position. They know what they want from the outset, and they aren't even open to hearing what the country has to say. Whereas another said that recipients of World Bank loans are psychologically pressured to either take it or leave it, and then the country ends up with conditions that it has no way of honoring and a contract that cannot be implemented. In other words, it's suggesting the World Bank is a big bureaucratic institution that's imposing its projects from the top down, that is putting a lot of unrealistic stipulations and qualifications on its loans. It's making unrealistic demands on the country that is being loaned the money. It's saying take it or leave it. It's refusing to negotiate or to engage in a dialogue. And then the project is not surprisingly a disaster because the bureaucrats are not aware or sensitive to the local conditions. So this is an interesting expose of one of the major organs of the world capitalist economic system.
Also, we have to ask the question, well, why would World Bank and IMF lend money to so many failing projects? It could be that they just don't even care whether the projects come to fruition or not. If we look at the terms under which World Bank and also IMF, closely related institutions, loans go under, usually it has to do with opening up the company's borders to international capital, liberalization of economic policy, in other words, basically making all sorts of structural economic reforms within the country. So it doesn't really matter if the bank's project fails or not, because what happens is because the project was initiated, the company's opened up to international capital, all sorts of foreign money can come in and buy up the country, and usually if the project fails, then the country has to sell off its natural resources cheap to just anyone who will come and get them, whatever multinational from the US or Europe or Japan comes along, and in that way it fuels the flow of international capital around the world.
In fact, the big corporations are the ones that benefit from the largesse of these loans. An example that's cited in this report of a failed project is the building of a dam in the Rio-San Francisco area of Brazil that resulted in the displacement of 40,000 people. It's caused all kinds of environmental damage. So far it hasn't even been finished because it's a possibly impossible project to build this dam in this area. It was a flawed project, but it's just wreaked tremendous havoc. But the corporations that got the contracts to build this have reaped big profits from this, and it's just the people and the environment that are suffering from these projects. I think you're absolutely right that this is just a way of having capital flow through big corporations and affecting the economic policies of these countries to open them up for economic development, resulting in a lot of failed projects, as well as, in this case, a very ecologically damaging one and a humanly disastrous one.
Usually the mainstream media portrays Israelis as the innocent victims of Palestinian terrorism, while downplaying the fact that many more Palestinians die a violent death each year at the hand of the Israelis and the general state of oppression that the Palestinians live in. One factor which has been virtually ignored in both the mainstream and even most of the leftist media is the presence of undercover military units that pose as Arabs and then infiltrate Palestinian communities, murdering resistors and a lot of innocent bystanders as well. In last December's Lies of Our Times, the article Israel's Unreported Death Squads details how information has been suppressed about Israeli death squad activity in the occupied territories. Organizations such as Amnesty International, the Middle East Watch, Al-Haq, which is a branch of the International Commission of Jurists, and B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, have all directly or indirectly confirmed the existence of death squads who killed 29 Palestinians in the first 9 months of 1992. The lack of reporting on this issue can also be traced to the behavior of Israeli authorities and complicity on the part of editors stateside and in Europe. Journalists who have attempted to report on death squad activities have been roughed up, had their credentials suspended, and even had attempts on their lives made. Steve Weissman, for instance, of the London's Financial Times, was attacked by several men on a Jerusalem street, and Paul Taylor, who worked with Weissman on reporting these activities, barely escaped a car bombing after they tried to publish a story in the Financial Times. Now, the editors have also been known to kill these stories when they come out. The American media in particular has ignored events that would likely galvanize public sympathy for the Palestinians. U.S.-based humanitarian organizations have released reports on youthful victims of death squads, including a 14-year-old boy, Mohammed Ja'afra, who was shot by Israeli soldiers wearing Arab dress. After shooting him, the soldiers refused to let ambulances into the village, and he consequently bled to death after 2 hours. The 2 Israelis who reported the shooting were also arrested and charged with interfering with the Israeli army. You can imagine what would happen if honest reporting took place on these issues, especially if they were accompanied by large front-page pictures of dead children and grieving relatives. You hardly ever see that when it's an Arab family that's been bereaved. On the other hand, if it's an Israeli family, you get all the sympathy press, the sympathy reporting, leaving out the context in which either of these things occurs.
I see the same thing happening on National Public Radio. I don't watch all that much television as much as I'd like to. I don't have time. But I do listen to Morning Edition and All Things Considered. All Things Considered. I noticed, however, their such distorted reporting always comes from somebody from Jerusalem, and it's always from the Israeli point of view. I think Linda Gradstein is the person who was the reporter from NPR, and they always say all these Israelis were stabbed or killed by the Palestinians, etc., etc. And they never give any background. They say, well, why are the Palestinians angry? They never say the fact that the settlers are there and they took over, they kicked off the Palestinians off of their land, out of their homes, and they've taken over the land, and that's what they're settling on. And no wonder the Arabs are angry about it. But you never see that. You never hear that on National Public Radio.
When you look at the news, one way that they frame it is by giving it a very subjective cast. It's always taking the viewpoint of the Israelis, never the viewpoint of the Palestinians, which would be equally easily done. And this is one way that they bias their apparently objective reporting, by taking the viewpoint of one side or the other, taking the viewpoint of American corporations, taking the viewpoint of Israeli citizens, taking the viewpoint of Europeans versus people in some other country. You constantly bias the news, creating an identification on the part of the American public with whatever, international organs or other peoples that the media wants us to believe in.
There's an interesting story in the Village Voice this week that indicates that the folks that are being implicated in the World Trade Center bombing, in particular the mosque in New Jersey that's associated with this Egyptian Islamic fundamentalist, all these folks were closely related to the CIA when they were fighting the Russians in Afghanistan. The same groups were Islamic fundamentalists who were fighting with the Afghan rebels and being supported by the CIA. This is why they were able to get into the U.S. in the first place and move around so easily, because they had U.S. government connections. Now they're being blamed for the bombing of the World Trade Center, which is very suspicious.
Also, there's a general belief, as yet undocumented, in the Arab community in both the U.S. and in Egypt that Mossad had a hand with these fundamentalists in helping them to bomb the World Trade Center. That's the Israeli intelligence agency, who of course would try to take these extremists and work with them and cultivate them to make all the more moderate elements, the less violent elements in Arab society and Islamic society look bad.
Already, Israel has claimed that this bombing makes it clear that they were justified with their repressive policies towards Hamas and other alleged terrorist groups. And I've been going through these computer bulletin boards, and there has been quite a bit of discussion on this issue, with many people advocating this theory and others poo-bahing it. So it is an interesting speculation.
The Socialist Labor Party's newspaper, The People, has a couple of articles, or 3 or 4, in a column called Hammer Blows. Here's one of them. The U.S. Army physician was turned down by Army officials when he tried to get conscientious objector status while treating wounded soldiers and civilians during the Persian Gulf War. The Army board said that it doubted the doctor's sincerity, because he said he didn't want to be part of the U.S. Killing machine over there. The Army said that they really doubted the doctor's sincerity, that he didn't want to kill things over there for the United States, because, and I quote, "As a doctor, the major is involved in killing forms of life that can also be seen as having a path to live, such as viral and bacteriological entities." So watch out. The next time you swat a mosquito or a fly, it may ruin your chances to be a conscientious objector.
And speaking of the Gulf War, let's turn now to Ed Griffin-Nolan's highly acclaimed
video essay on the Gulf War, Lines in the Sand, a very moving and informative work which shows how the American people were so heavily propagandized by the government and the media so that the population as a whole would accept the Gulf War, not just accept it, but support it.
Between August 1990 and January 1991, the United States amassed 540,000 troops, 1,500 airplanes, 6 aircraft carrier groups, thousands of tanks, and tons of supplies in the Arabian Desert. In just 43 days of aerial bombardment and 100 hours of ground combat, U.S. and Allied troops defeated Saddam Hussein's forces and drove the Iraqi army from Kuwait. They also drove the ghost of Vietnam from the American political landscape. Vietnam, a long, unpopular war. 55,000 U.S. troops died. The country split down the middle and scorned abroad. When public support eroded, the military and national security establishment blamed the media for losing the war. In the wake of Vietnam, they determined not to let it happen again. But Vietnam had made war, even wrapped in the language of national security, harder to sell to the public. In the 1980s, when military spending accelerated and nuclear arms proliferated, millions took to the streets in protest. Ronald Reagan's attempt to fight a war by proxy in Central America met with stiff public resistance. America remembered the pain of Vietnam and was not eager to see it repeated. Vietnam had taught the press and the public to be skeptical and question official definitions of national security. It took a war like the one against Iraq, a war seen as relatively painless, to change all that. The Persian Gulf War was a kind of national therapy session. "43 days of televised Desert Storm replaced images of division, death, and defeat with images of military might, patriotism, and international acclaim for America. It didn't happen by accident. From the launching of the very first sorties, TV images were carefully controlled to manipulate public opinion and rally support for the war. On January 15th, the eve of war, polls showed a nation evenly divided. 50% said that we should go to war, and 50% urged continuing economic sanctions against Iraq. When asked if going to war was worth risking 1,000 U.S. casualties, nearly 2/3 of us believed, as did General Schwarzkopf, that sanctions were preferable. But by January 20th, after days of round-the-clock reports of high success rates and low casualties, public support shot up to 80%. The military built this support by directing media attention towards images of success and away from the grim realities of war. Military planners learned their lesson from Vietnam, that modern wars are not won and lost on battlefields, but in front of television screens, where attitudes and perceptions are bought and sold.
Did it work?
In the 1980s, the Pentagon developed and rehearsed a repertoire of ways to fight wars in any number of circumstances. Rapid invasions like Panama and Grenada, low-intensity wars in Central America, nuclear war against the Soviet Union, and others still to be announced. They also spent billions learning to sell war to the public. Since Vietnam, the military has been studying techniques for marketing its story, by managing the timed release of positive images and information and limiting reporters' access to combat situations.
And we are here because we believe in freedom, our freedom and the freedom of others.
Acknowledging the power of television to shape public perceptions, an Army trainer wrote in 1985 that, quote, "The material will of any country is significantly influenced by the images presented by the media."
We're not walking away until our mission is done, until the invader is out of Kuwait. And that may well be where you come in.
The Persian Gulf War was a proving ground not only for new military hardware, but for new information control strategies. Michael Deaver, Ronald Reagan's principal media advisor, called the Persian Gulf War such a propaganda success that a team of public relations experts could not have planned it better. On television, this was a neat and clean and very quick war.
We're going to walk through the country and liberate Kuwait. That's the way I feel. That's the way I feel about it.
America tuned in to watch the war live. Instead, we were shown a new type of war, carefully scripted by Pentagon image makers and presented as news.
We have air superiority. We can go wherever we want, whenever we want. Every time they send an airplane up to do something about it, it gets shot down.
The television camera was the secret weapon in the U.S. arsenal for Desert Storm. Unlike Vietnam, where TV images of war's horror made their way home to us, in the Persian Gulf, the tube was solidly in government hands. Military PR experts selected, drilled, and rehearsed their briefers carefully for each appearance.
I wouldn't comment on what our capabilities are there. As the President said, we are prepared to defend ourselves.
Press officers only allowed interviews with selected troops and hovered nearby throughout. Reports were censored before they reached us. Hometown reporters inclined to write human interest stories were flown for free to Saudi Arabia, while journalists critical of the war were left out of press pools. Networks turned endless hours of airtime over to Pentagon briefings and commentary by former government officials. We never saw the people at the other end of the bombing runs. Due to Iraqi paranoia, media cooperation, and Allied censorship, we never had the chance to see people like this man, Mohammed Qadir, a geology professor and father of 5 living in Baghdad.
You know, the governmental speaker from Washington said that the shelter was a military shelter. But really not. Really not. Because about 1,600 people inside, most, 99% were civilian. And most of them are women and girls and children.
On February 13, in the middle of the night, a pair of laser-guided bombs dropped from U.S. F-117 stealth bombers. A mile below, in Baghdad, a bomb shelter with 500 or more people inside exploded in flames. Muhammad's wife and 4 daughters, all sleeping inside, were killed in the attack.
We were a happy family, but now I'm so sad.
He and other residents of the neighborhood identified this as a civilian shelter. The Pentagon warned us not to believe that these bodies were those of Iraqi civilians. It was the only time during the war when America's conscience was challenged by what we saw on television. Even after the war, when censorship by both sides was relaxed, few stories depicting the human cost for the Iraqi people made it to the U.S. Reports continued to speak of this as a clean war, even as doctors warned that 170,000 children faced death from disease and malnutrition due to bombed-out electrical plants and other infrastructure targets. Former military officers at the Center for Defense Information have concluded that these targets were of little or no military relevance to the stated objective of evicting Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The Pentagon still refuses to give estimates for the numbers of Iraqi civilians killed by the smart bombs that poured into Baghdad and other cities, and the media does not press the issue. The carpet bombing conducted against Iraqi positions went on completely out of camera range. The smart bombs grabbed the headlines, even though 93% of the bombs dropped consisted of simple, indiscriminate explosives guided only by gravity. When U.S. pilots bombed columns of Iraqis retreating from Kuwait City in what one pilot called a turkey shoot, the military buried the bodies in mass graves before reporters could visit the site. What we saw on television was a deadly video game, a dangerously sanitized, bloodless version of warfare, brought to you by Pentagon sources, defense contractors, and quarantined reporters. In the wake of the war, many in the United States have been eagerly celebrating this military victory. But victory at what price?
Lines in the sand constantly showed us how the American people were propagandized by the Pentagon and the U.S. power structure. What may seem strange is that American people continually believe the lies they are told by the government and by corporations year after year, decade after decade. Why is this? Maybe we can find out next.
Today on Alternative Views, our guest is John Downing, Professor of Communications at the University of Texas. John is author of the book Radical Media and editor of Film and Politics and the Third World and Questioning the Media.
John, you're aware of and have written about mass media, particularly the alternative media or radical media from all over the world. And I'd like to ask you a question. We had a person on our program who was in Parliament from New Zealand. She said she felt when she got into the United States, she's all over the world, when she comes to the United States, she feels like she's constantly being propagandized in the most clumsy way. We did another interview with one of the world's finest documentary producers, filmmakers, from Syria. And he was talking about the same fact. Even a police state like Syria, he could watch documentaries on all kinds of subjects from all over the world on Syrian TV, but not on American TV. And it seems to me that Americans must be the most successfully propagandized people in the world.
Well, I don't know that there's a kind of international prize for that as yet, but coming here from elsewhere, I think what strikes me is the extent to which the United States, on one level, seems like a gigantic island. Very inward-looking, somewhat self-satisfied, One is perpetually being told it's the most democratic society in the world, with the best media system in the world, and the finest education system in the world, and so on. And all this sort of patriotic patting on the back, even if it were true, I don't think is appropriate. And I don't, I'm afraid, think it's true. I don't have some particular kind of hostility towards the United States. I've lived here for 12 years. I intend to go on living here. And I've learned and gained very much from being here. But at the same time, it is astonishing just the large proportion of citizens of this country who are content with what I regard as a very kind of thin gruel of information and understanding about the rest of the world, who are content simply to kind of sit there. Now, I think the fault is not only theirs. I think the fault is also in the media and educational system, which tends not to prompt people to see the United States as what it is, part of the rest of the world. I think the fact that the US economy is now shrinking as a proportion of the world economy is actually gradually pushing Americans to recognize this fact, which has always been a reality. But it's a slow process, and in the meantime, it really is only sort of those people who go abroad not as tourists, but actually to live overseas, or who go maybe in the Peace Corps in some cases, or whatever, who actually take the trouble to ingest what they find somewhere else and to look at their own nation with new eyes, that I think are bringing the seeds of some kind of renewal to this society. Otherwise, we're just all going to be caught up in our kind of suburban complacency and slowly die of stagnation.
Does it seem strange to you, or is it consistent with my opinion about Americans being so easily led around by the nose, that people can be so satisfied with an obvious phony like Reagan, a crook like Nixon, somebody, and get high approval ratings for the invasion of a small country like Grenada and Panama?
Well, you've got two or three different things going on there. I think that a lot of people need to feel that the president they have elected is a good and worthy person, at least until the point 4 years later where they have an opportunity to unseat that person. And until the sort of the run-up period. But until then, a lot of people need to feel that the president is honest, far-sighted, intelligent, and good-willed. And so, in some sense, why they're responding to Reagan or Nixon in that way, I think, is a personal need in themselves. Playing into that is the fact that the media have always been much tougher on Democratic presidents than Republican presidents. I'm not a member of the Democratic Party. I'm certainly not a member of the other one. So I'm not putting out some party line. But when I think of the kind of mistakes that Jimmy Carter made and the way the media treated him, compared to the kind of stuff that Reagan did and the way the media didn't treat him, the difference seems to me absolutely astonishing.
But there's very powerful reasons for that, and that is Reagan was deregulating the media, which is exactly what the media corporations wanted, so that they could own many more affiliate stations, so they could have mergers with big corporations, so they could go wild in the bottom line and go for a profit by cutting back news, documentaries, other public service material that they previously had regulations on them for. Plus, Reagan was giving them big tax breaks, and they were in the high income brackets that were benefiting from those. So Reagan basically bought off the corporate media. Now, I just want to dissent a little bit from this view that Americans are just led around by their nose. Bush is an interesting example of this. Whereas the people stupidly went wild for the Gulf War, and Bush had the highest approval rating in history and was able to live off that for about, a year or so. Eventually, it wore away, and people eventually saw through Bush. No thanks necessarily to the media, but simply through their own reflections and their own coming to critical perceptions. He got the lowest percentage of votes of any, I think, president in history when you count how many votes Perot got, 20% of the electorate. So I think you have a contradiction here, and I think people really want alternative information when you give them alternative information, they respond very positively to it. So they're not just simply, you know, cows who are out there chewing their cuds, or, you know, just robots that are being programmed by
it's true, you know, but let me kind of throw in a further thought, and that is, I mean, tying it to, maybe we're getting too recent, but I mean, tying it to the Perot phenomenon. It seems to me kind of a little sad that people, when they want to protest the conduct of their government, line up behind a somewhat quirky billionaire whose only critique of the situation is the government, as though the corporations during the Reagan and Bush era had somehow had no responsibility for anything that was going on, either economically or politically or socially. And it seems to me that to allow themselves to say, well, you know, the trouble is the rats in Congress, or the Congress bank, or all those Congress people, clean out the government and then everything's in place. I mean, do we not have corporate leadership here? Does this leadership exercise no authority in this country? Does it dictate nothing by way of policy? I mean, were they all asleep and at home, like Mr. Bush claimed to be, whenever anything was going on over Iran, and Iran-gate and Contra-gate and so on? I mean, what is going on here, where only one source of our problems can be targeted as responsible for those problems? It seems sad to me.
Well, this is a function of the corporate media that sometimes critiques the state, particularly if they don't like the policies of the people that are in there, and that play into a residual populism that is suspicious of governmental power that goes all the way back to the American Revolution. But what they don't do, the corporate media, the mainstream media, is to criticize themselves. That is, the big corporations that run the country and that own and control the corporate media. So the people just don't have the information to see that it's big corporations that are controlling Reagan, for instance. He's just a pawn for corporate America. That Bush is part of corporate America, the first member of the ruling class, literally, since Roosevelt, to be a major politician in himself, to carry out policies shamelessly in the interest solely of the corporate class and not in the interest of anyone else. This kind of criticism you just never see on the mainstream media, because that would be a critique of the very center of wealth and power in the United States, which is the corporate structure that owns and controls the media. So I think that's part of the problem of information in this country, and why we need alternative media that are free from the ownership and control of these big corporations, so that people can see to the extent to which corporate power and corporations are part of the serious problems we face in the U.S.
Well, that's what part of what C. Wright Mills called focusing of the American people on their attention on this noisy third or fourth layer of power in the United States Congress. Not a heck of a lot happens there of real substantive nature, but you focus the discontent and hate and attention on Congress. Don't talk about the power structure. Don't talk about the ruling class. That's part of the propagandizing of the American people I was talking about.
Right.
Here's a good example of how the power structure covers up its malevolence.
On February 9th, the New York Times reported that George Bush may have pardoned Caspar Weinberger last Christmas Eve because he feared being called to the stand if the former defense secretary stood trial. Prosecutor Lawrence Walsh, in what David Johnston called a broad assault on Mr. Bush, released a previously undisclosed memo from December 18th in which the lame duck president was warned that prosecutors plan to have both him and former President Reagan testify. Going further, Walsh revealed a wealth of fresh insights that would, quote, would have exposed the administration's efforts to conceal the facts of the Iran arms sales. While top Republicans assert that Walsh is trying to build a criminal case out of a policy dispute, Walsh counter-asserts that Weinberger would have faced prosecution for serious crimes. He continued, saying, in preventing this process from going forward, President Bush did a grave disservice to the citizens of this country because, contrary to the impression created by the false testimony that he gave earlier, Weinberg was a knowing participant in the Iran-Contra affair. The prosecutor also said that George Shultz, if called to the stand, would have expressed his concern that the White House had tried to rearrange the record to protect Reagan from the legal consequences of his involvement. Couldn't you see that? Reagan in jail.
Excellent.
Followed by George Bush.
Yeah, George Bush could go to jail for what he did.
Yeah.
This cover-up had implications far more reaching than this, however, even. Congressional committees first sought materials on Iran-Contra in 1987 and had the illegal actions of the Reagan-Bush administration come to light then. Bush could be in jail now, and it's also highly unlikely that Bush would have been elected president when it came out to the American public that he had lied vociferously.
And we have Lee Hamilton and a group of Democrats that helped cover up the Iran-Contra scandal in the first place to thank for that. The same Lee Hamilton was involved in a cover-up of the October surprise recently, where he published an op-ed piece in the New York Times justifying a committee that he was in charge of that was supposed to investigate whether the charges had any basis, and he claimed they didn't, and the whole thing should be dismissed. So the Democrats were also implicated in this cover-up of Iran-Contra.
In April 2nd, in an article entitled "Drug Companies Warn Administration Against Vaccine Programs," Philip Hiltz of the New York Times reports that fearing a prospect of lower drug prices, drug company executives said today that they might slow or actually stop the development of new vaccines if the Clinton administration moves ahead with the plan to vaccinate all American children by the age of 2. Now, Dr. Howard Pearson, a president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, said that the administration's plan was crucial to the health of American children. Right now, quite a few children go without immunization. There are diseases like whooping cough and measles, which he said should be in the history books but aren't. And it seems like this is one good thing that the Clinton administration could do that the Bush administration wouldn't do, which is to bring along a comprehensive vaccination program in which the government would spend $1.1 billion and buy vaccines for virtually every child in America and make sure that those vaccines then get distributed free of charge to clinics, schools, even private doctors to make sure that every child gets vaccinated. There would also be a associated program to seek out children in poor areas who might not get vaccinated, and in that way we could eliminate quite a few of these debilitating diseases. But the drug companies, and you know they're really poor these days, the rising profits of the 80s have hurt them severely. The fact that their profit margin goes several times ahead of that of inflation is obviously causing a lot of devastation there, saying that, well, no, if we can't guarantee certain profits, then it's just not worthwhile for us to develop these vaccines, despite the fact that this program will save hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of lives and improve the quality of life of many people. They just can't do it. And although the Times doesn't say this, you can see it as just blackmail.
Ali, there's a parallel to this that occurred during World War II, when a lot of the major U.S. corporations were continuing to do business and help the Axis powers that we were fighting all the time, making a lot of money and selling to both sides and actually producing airplanes and communications equipment and motorized trucks and all for the Axis powers while we were fighting them. Well, the oil companies were also doing business with the Axis powers as well as selling to the United States, but they were selling oil cheaper to Japan, it turned out, than they were the U.S. Navy. They were also refueling, went to the extent of refueling the German U-boats at sea while they were sinking Allied shipping. Well, although the United States and FDR knew about this, they didn't do anything about it, but it finally got so bad that the FDR called the oil company executives in and said, hey, you got to stop selling to these guys, we're fighting them. And they told FDR, hey, we don't have to sell you our oil. So nothing happened to them. Sounds like this with the pharmaceutical company.
Yeah.
We previously had the video essay on the Gulf War, Lines in the Sand. Now let's turn to the Vietnam War and see a short documentary about the tragic consequences of Agent Orange on one family and what they were trying to do to fight government neglect of the situation.
An estimated 11 million gallons of Agent Orange was sprayed over Vietnam, which is a country geographically comparable to the state of Georgia.
And how did you come in contact with it?
Well, personally, I was exposed by direct spraying. We also filled our canteens from local streams, bomb craters, rice paddies, wherever we could get it. Much of this water was contaminated with Agent Orange. Also through eating local fruits and vegetables and farm animals, livestock, chickens and pigs and stuff.
I've read where dioxin is just absolutely the most horrible thing ever invented by man as far as being deadly and for a long period of time.
National Geographic has said that it is the most deadly chemical molecule man has ever made. But it's very toxic. 3 ounces could wipe out New York City if it were placed in their drinking water.
100,000 to 1,000,000 times more potent than thalidomide in causing birth defects among children and people exposed to it. That's dioxin.
Right.
And we know the awful widespread tragedy of thalidomide.
The reason that this deputy director with the FDA felt it was that bad is that thalidomide, as tragic as it was a one-generation thing. Dioxin changes the chromosomes, so it's an ongoing problem. The children born with birth defects because of dioxin, their children and their children's children will carry this forward until and unless genetic engineering were to become that, that helpful. So it is in that way 1,000,000 times worse.
So there's tremendous danger to the gene pool of mankind.
You take 2.5 million veterans, if they are able to have children, if the condition has not caused sterility among the vets.
Which it does.
And their children would have birth defects, and then when their children marry, that would double. And it could get out of hand real quick. It could get out of hand exceptionally quick. And it's not just Vietnam veterans that have the danger. 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D, the other chemical, are both under scrutiny. They've both been banned by the U.S. Forestry Service because of numerous occasions of miscarriages and spontaneous abortions by pregnant mothers in areas close to forests where they were spraying it for weed and brush control.
Well, let's take a look at that film that we were telling you about. It was made by Celeste Villarreal, and it tells your story.
Told us it was harmless and that by spraying the stuff that the leaves would fall off the trees. Approximately 11.3 million gallons of the stuff was sprayed in South Vietnam from fixed-wing aircraft. Agent Orange was composed of an inevitable byproduct known as dioxin, the most toxic small molecule made by man. Since returning from Vietnam, it's caused a lot of health problems for myself, strange fatigue, neurological problems, respiratory distress. I constantly keep colds and flu-like illnesses. This went on for several years after I came back from Vietnam. I went to many different doctors, and in 1971 our first child was born and had multiple birth defects, including missing fingers on his hands and missing bones in his wrists, and his wrists were turned inward, back touching his forearm. My wife and I thought this was probably just one of those things that happens 1 in a million times. So we were very shocked when in 1972 our youngest son, Michael, was born with even worse defects, more missing fingers, the same missing wrist bones, and also missing the long bone in his left forearm. And the wrists were turned under in this case, too. We still didn't make the connection between all these health problems and Agent Orange because we'd never heard really of the problems associated with Agent Orange. After intensive research at science libraries and looking through medical journals and scientific journals and genetic journals, my wife and I decided to set up a little information center in our home, and we're distributing copies of different medical and scientific journal reports on the dangers of exposure to Agent Orange and dioxin. We were getting calls from men 29, 30 years old with 4 or 5 different kinds of cancer all through their body. And after years of frustration and having doors shut in our face everywhere we turned, we decided to set up a nonprofit organization, and we called it the Brotherhood of Vietnam Veterans, in that basically was what we wanted it to be, a true brotherhood where veterans, no matter how bad off they were, could somehow find it within themselves to help other veterans, at least, if nothing else, by listening to their problems and sharing understanding as only they could, having experienced exactly the same thing. And where we're at right now is trying to overturn the ignorance and apathy of the government, the VA, and the American people in general, and to bring this problem out into the open, because we feel with the amount of evidence we've compiled in this short period of time, were it made public to the American people, they could not help but sympathize with the problem and see that the problem is corrected immediately. It was during this period of time that we were contacted by Rama Plummer, whose husband had died from cancer caused from exposure by Agent Orange.
4 years ago, my husband Paul died of cancer that was all over his body. With a letter that I received from his private physician, I went to the VA and filed the Agent Orange claim. I was denied and told that I needed clinical proof. I started watching my children's health. We had one of our daughters taken to MD Anderson, where a tumor from her upper lip was surgically removed. It's now suspected that she has a tumor inside the spinal cord. Her twin is emotionally disturbed and has a severe learning disability. The 2 younger children both have a lump on their lower left rib that doctors cannot diagnose. They can feel it, they can see it, they know it's there, but it won't show up on an x-ray, and it hurts. And the youngest one has some form of an eye disease that requires her to wear glasses constantly. And with the information that Danny and Donna had, we have that clinical proof, and yet the VA still denies it. Our real need is to get all this information together, and our only real hope for any results is going to be through public exposure and awareness.
I actually guess I have a lot to be thankful for in a lot of ways. Even though my children are severely handicapped, they both were blessed with good minds and otherwise healthy bodies other than the problem with their hands, and they are luckily able now to play in soccer, where ironically it's against the rules to use your hands. We think it's pretty bad that men can go and fight for their country and then at the same time be poisoned by their country, and then when they seek medical help through the channels supposedly set up specifically to handle veterans' problems, they are lied to, laughed at, cheated on, and generally just ignored. We think that a lot of our future lies with the youth of America today, and their intelligence and their open-mindedness should be able to solve any problem that should come up. Air Force has actually dumped tons of it in the ocean to get rid of it. They dumped it. What we know of, the major disposal, they had a special ship, the Vulcan, and it was taken into the South Pacific, and all of the Agent Orange stockpiles were burned in this special incinerator ship. All the people working around it wore special suits that included life support systems so that they wouldn't breathe any of the fumes, because for one thing, when you incinerate dioxin or Agent Orange, it makes as much as 100 times more dioxin than was originally in it.
Oh my God.
We don't know that even by incinerating it, the dioxin was destroyed. It may have simply been changed into a gas and released into the atmosphere. They don't know. But anyway, the suits and everything that were used aboard the ship were then incinerated after. And then the VA and the government, Department of Defense, everyone turns around and tells us, the Vietnam veteran, this stuff is harmless. If it's harmless, why all the precautions in disposal? Why did South America not want our stockpiles when we attempted to sell it to them, even though we promised to clean up the amount of dioxin in it? Why are other Vietnam vets, Australians, there's 1,500 Australian Vietnam vets that have united and are complaining of the same exact physical and psychological problems of the American Vietnam vets. There's over 4,000 South Korean soldiers that were in South Vietnam service. They're having the same type of symptoms. So it's not strictly something that occurred to Americans. And that's not even considering the millions of people in Southeast Asia that are still over there and still having to live in contaminated countryside and drink contaminated water and eat contaminated food.
And that's Alternative Views for this time. We have a lot of people to thank for making our program possible. Brian Lynch, Eric Eubank, Kevin L. West, Rosalind Peacock, Catherine Galatera, as well as Sue Kim, Roger Newsonblatt, Maria Lopez, and Joelle May. We're particularly appreciative of Ed Griffin-Nolan for letting us use his video essay on the Gulf War, Lines in the Sand. Pete Worth was very helpful in facilitating this. If you're interested in getting more information about Lines in the Sand, write to Griffin Worth Associates, 168 Parkway Drive, Syracuse, New York, 13207. And the phone number is area code 315-476-3396. That's Griffin Worth Associates, 168 Parkway Drive, Syracuse, New York, 13200. Letters from around the country, and yours is welcome also. Goodbye.